really, really nice as well. Anyway, I'll stop talking about her and start talking about myself now. So yeah, thank you for being here. I think it's funny, I have a lot of family in Memphis, and it kind of worked out really nicely. I stayed with my wife's brother in Mumford last night, and she has an uncle in Bartlett. I probably should have stayed with him instead, but it's nice to be here, to see family, and to be here to turn as well. I think it's funny that you guys are talking about the chili cook-off, because Memphis is food. I mean, barbecue, chili, everything. So I need to come back for that and try just chili. If he's saying it's good, it's got to be good. But yeah, thank you all for being here and for having me here. I live in Chattanooga, so it's a little bit of a drive, but like I said, I have family here I can stay with, and it's a pleasure being here. I got to talk to quite a few of you guys beforehand, and when I was looking for this place, I've already mentioned this to some people. This is a big building, and there are a lot of entrances to the parking lot. And I was following the GPS, and it had me take this wild U-turn into this back entrance, looking around, not sure if I'm in the right space, but I saw a truck with logs in the back, and well, chances are this is probably the wood turning spot, and here we are. But today we're going to turn a heart on the lathe, and it's kind of a fun project. It has a lot of different types of turning. You get some face grain turning, some spindle turning, you get to make a little end grain bowl, and there's some challenges that we'll talk about. It should be a pretty good time, but a little bit about myself aside from where I live. I've been turning for a few years, not a huge amount of time, a few years. I've worked with wood for a little while, longer than that, but turning is about the best thing in the world, and I think most of you will agree with that. If not, you're on your way to agreeing with that. So, it is a thing that you can stretch your imagination, and you get a little bit more instant gratification than building furniture or anything like that. And it's a cathartic thing too. We say lathe therapy. So if you're having a rough day, go to the shop and just make some shavings. It doesn't even have to be something that you're making. Just watch the shavings fly off the tool, and usually it makes you feel good until you get a catch, and then reset that. But it is a fun thing, and I'm fortunate to be in the position to be able to demonstrate and talk to you guys, and it's just another opportunity to turn some more and get paid a little bit for it, which is that's great too. But and they gave me the check ahead of time, so if I do a poor job, I already got paid, so that's great. But in all seriously, it should be a good time, and we're going to do a lot of things. I teach as my profession. I'm a teacher at a community college in Chattanooga, Chattanooga State Community College. And I deal with unruly students all the time, and I'm saying that if there's something that happens where you can't hear me, you can't see what I'm doing, or if you have a question, feel free to interrupt me, stop me. I'm not going to be offended at all. It's all for the benefit of you guys.
What do you teach?
I teach anatomy and physiology, mostly biology and everything. I'm kind of the yes man, so if they need a class and they're going to pay me for it, I'll teach it and learn it. We're lifelong learners, right? So it's great.
You teach anatomy, and you're going to be doing a heart.
Oh yeah, I should do a more anatomically correct heart though. I don't tell my coworkers that I'm doing a cartoon one. It kind of fits. The whole reason I started making these hearts was, I know some of you, and I recognize some of your names and faces. And I talked to Larry earlier today. Like we've gone far into the day earlier this morning. But if you're involved in the AAW forum, if you're not, it's a really great resource to be able to, one, connect with people, but also to get inspired by seeing what other people are doing. And they have forum challenges, monthly challenges. It's a little bit delayed, but one of the challenges a couple of years ago was to turn a heart or make a heart. And there are a lot of ways you can do it. The more conventional ways are split turning. You turn a spindle, cut it in half on the 45, and then turn one segment around, and you have this nice tube-shaped heart. So some people did that. Some people carved a heart, and I wanted to try something different, and to figure out a way to turn a heart on a couple of different axes. And I think it looks a little bit more like a heart than some of the other methods. And it's pretty fun too. It's how you get a variety of types of turning with it. But it all stemmed from a forum challenge, and talking about the President's Challenge and all these sorts of things. If you don't participate in those, that's fine. Everyone's busy, but if you do, it's a great way to use that challenge as a jumping off point for something else. And finding your own way to make something, or being inspired by making something new, can take you in a whole different direction. You never know what's going to happen. Right? I will stop talking right now, unless there are any more questions, and we can get into actually what we're going to be doing today. Cool. So I am going to do a little bit of a magic trick at some point today. I'm going to start out with a piece of Badook, and the shavings can be a little bit funky, so I'll turn this a little bit, and then I'll do my magic trick, and I'll turn this into a piece of maple. You guys won't even see it. It'll be amazing. We're going from red to white. Right. But I do want to start out with this piece of Badook, mostly because yesterday when I was doing my final preparations, I was looking for another square piece of wood that was dry, and I just didn't have one. I had this piece. Well, all right, I guess I'll use it. But it's also really pretty, and we're making a heart, so it kind of makes sense to start out with a red wood. So one of the things that I like to do when I'm demonstrating is I like to pretend that everyone is at the same skill level, and that skill level is pretty basic. Right? So if I'm saying something and you're seeing in the audience thinking, of course, doing that, don't get offended. It's just I'm trying to speak to everyone, and I'll tell you my method. And everyone has different methods to do things, but I want everyone to be at this base level where we can all do something like this instead of doing something in a little bit more of a complicated way or with a specialized tool. So I'll use pretty basic tools and kind of go through the basic processes of this. But again, stop me if you have any questions, or interrupt me if you see I'm doing something wrong. Let's talk about it. Nothing wrong with that. With these hearts, the only thing that I don't like about I do love making these. Kind of a terrible thing to say, you don't like what you're demonstrating, but I do like making these. They do take a little bit more planning at the front end, because with a heart, there's no, just like an egg, there's no such thing as a perfect egg shape. You can have a perfect curve, but eggs are different. Same thing when you're making something like this. There's no perfect heart. Stylized hearts, you can have wide, short, tall, skinny, whatever, but you really just want to focus on having nice curves. That said, when I was starting making these, I was going through some different prototypes and thinking about the dimensions, and I found that using a nice square piece of wood, this is a 6 by 6 inches by 3 inches deep block, and it produces a pretty nice shape. And when I was figuring that out, I went through a couple of different sizes. So this would be a piece of white oak that I made that was pretty long and kind of skinny, and it makes somewhat of a heart shape. But if you look at it, it's like a blade almost, and it could kind of be a nice halberd or something like that. But it's kind of a funky shape to it. Likewise, I used another piece of oak, and this was a shorter, fatter piece, and it ended up looking like this. Not so much like a heart, maybe like a bat or something. I showed this to somebody, and she ended up making an owl with the same method, and it was kind of cool. Right? But through all that, I've kind of, and this is my method, right? Or this is my my design choice, right? Found that a nice square block is best. So with the planning part of it, we want to think about where your widest points are and the characteristic features of a heart. And so what I like to do is do a little bit of a layout. Now I used to do this fresh, starting with a piece of wood and measuring all these lines, separating the blocks into thirds in all dimensions. And that would take a while too, especially when you have something that isn't perfect. So I started using these templates that I made. This is just a piece of 6 by 6, and it really speeds up the process. So I'll talk about these dimensions really briefly, and then we'll actually start turning. It's probably not the most interesting thing to listen to somebody talk about this. But with the heart shape that I like the best, you have the widest point about a third of the way from the bottom, or from the top. And this little point right here is the center of where my tendons are going to be on the face. And that allows me to have this curve where we'll get to a stage in the making process where it kind of looks like I'm making a hot air balloon, and it's not a heart shape at all. This guy is not making a heart. But once you have that, and then you start making this curve on the face, because we have this little bowl that we'll make at the top, you start revealing this little dip. And if you put the tenon right here, which is a little bit in between the halfway points and the 1/3 from the top points, it ends up with a pretty nice curve where you can go from the top, revealing the nice lobes of the heart, and to the bottom where you have this nice point and this one smooth, continuous curve. If that all sounds like gobbledygook, we'll get to it and you'll actually see what I'm talking about. Right, so instead of going through the painstaking process of marking out each or laying out each piece of wood, I started using this template, which is really nice. I use an awl. You can use anything, but I have this old awl that I got for like a penny at an antique store. It was an old screwdriver, and I just turned it into an awl. And you can do that and make your points. And what I do like to do, I actually have a handout that I'll pass. I made 35 copies, but there may be more people here than that. I'm going to keep one just in case I forget when I'm in the process. I have something to reference. But I'll pass these out, and if we run out of papers, this was an American wood turner, but it's always nice to have a paper verse, I think. So you can start a folder, or I'll read a lot of books, and I like to read a book instead of, in my hands instead of on a screen. But if we run out of handouts, just get in contact with me and give your address, and I'll send you handouts, or your email address, and I'll mail you one. You can print it out yourself. There are plenty of, hopefully we have enough, but if not, just let me know and I'll get you one. But when I'm doing this, I like to at least make my tenon, or my center point on both sides. And we're assuming that we're starting out with a block that's been faced and it's relatively square, but it's not always the case. But if you have 2 points that are the same distance from the top and from the sides, at least you'll have a reference for when you're setting this up between centers. You can make something that's relatively symmetrical. Right? So that's what I did, and that's the nice thing about the template, because before I would have to lay out all the lines on both sides, and it would just take forever. So I've got my templates, put a hole in, or put a hole for my center points, did it on the other side with just making this center line. And now that I know that this template didn't change and I'm using the same top and side as a reference, then my points are going to be as close as possible, the same spot on both faces. I also made a mark on the top, and this is going to be set up where we start. We're going to start with the block like this. And I want to make sure that my center point is the same distance, or it's in the middle of each face on both sides, right, again, for symmetry. So let's start by doing that.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
How important is it to, starting with the piece of wood, for the where the grain is? Do you always want to do it at the same reference point?
I always start it like this. We're starting with a spindle orientation, so my grain is running parallel to the ways. You can start it the other way. It gets a little bit messy though, especially when you're roughing out the top. You end up with a lot of tear outs on these corners if it's in face grain according to the ways orientation. This way, starting in spindle orientation, you end up with pretty minimal tear out on the corners. And then even if you do, when you switch to face grain orientation and you're making your final curves, it's a way to get rid of all of that tear outs and any sort of wood that might have splintered off. You can do it either way. This is just the way that I like. Plus, thinking about it from a design standpoint, having the grain running up and down, I think looks a little bit better than side to side. And it also gives you a little bit more strength for the points of the heart. Right here, if I have this spindle orientation where my long grain is coming down to the point, that's a little bit stronger than if I had some end grain running this way. Because when we make our heart, we'll have this pretty sharp point, and if the grain's running this direction, it's easy for that point to chip off. Right? But it's your wood, you can make it any way you want. And I've never made one with the grain running the other way, and I think it could work pretty nicely depending on what wood you're using and what grain, and something like marble wood or something where you have those really striking grain differences could look pretty cool, or if you put them off kilter, would look like these interesting stripes and patterns on the side. But this is just the way that I do it, and I like the strength and the utility you get from having the grain in this orientation. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. No one's ever asked that before. I've done this demo several times, and you kind of start to predict the questions that you'll get. And it's always a nice thing to get a fresh question. Makes me think a little bit. I always appreciate that. All right. So this is this is the point where, you know, if I'm at my shop, I'm pretty safety conscious, I'll say that, but I don't always use a face shield, and I know that I should, right? You should always use a face shield. It's the safest method, and freak accidents happen, and that's going to be the safest way to protect yourself. But sometimes I don't. This I almost always do, especially when you have something flying pretty fast. You'll hear a little bit of a propeller sound. I'm not Jimmy Clues. I'm not going to turn this up and say it can't go any faster, but we'll have this going, and you know, I'll definitely put my face shield on. This is another thing too. If you notice that I started the lathe and my face shield's not down, just can be a little bit of a space cadet sometimes. Let me know. Say face shield. I'm not going to be offended by that. When we start out, I am just going to use a 1/2-inch bull gouge, and I have a sweat back grind on it. It's probably about 50-ish degrees. You know, I started with a 50-degree measurement, and I haven't measured it since, and I just kind of try to keep the same profile. But it's this matters to you. It's a Thompson tool, which is great. I'm not a die-hard tool loyalist, right? But I do like Thompson tools for the most part. But I have other ones that I'll use, and most tools are going to be fine. So let's start with this. Something like this, definitely want to give it some spins before you turn it on, and make sure you're clearing your tool rest. And then I'll start. Let's see. You guys hear me with the face shield? It's clear? Yeah. Okay. You guys have a good audio setup. My club is a little bit lacking in this, so I appreciate that. We'll turn this up to, not crazy fast, but you can hear that. It's kind of a nice sound. This is about 1160 or so. And I used to do this with a spindle rough gouge, and it's pretty safe. You get some impact, but if you're holding your tool fine, you're not hitting end grain or anything like that. But I always weirded people out, so I switched to a bull gouge for the sake of demonstrating. I think it actually works better anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start roughing this to round and get a nice curved profile. All right, so here, again, I'm not going to try to talk through the fundamentals. This is how you should hold your tool and grit and everything. Yes, sir?
Yeah. Which side's going to be the top of the, just...
This will be the top of the heart, and this will be the bottom.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and you know, the first few steps we'll rough this around, and then we'll start focusing on making a tenon at the bottom. Yeah. So here we're just moving, and I'm just going to, you know, hold my tool down and my handle down and kind of move in. And take pretty light cuts. Right? Do this. Now, a lot of times when you're working, you'll see people just going back and forth, and that's fine too. But with something like this, almost like you're using a carbide tool or a scraper to rip out. It's nice to put some nibble in. And this is just a real fast way to get rid of this tool. You can go back and start doing this. You go back and forth. Right? And now I'll move my tool rest a little bit. Right? One tip, and this is something that it's one of those things that everybody probably does, is I always keep some Scotch-Brite pads on and you know, scrape my tool rest a little bit, and it gets it to glide smoothly. The more easily and the less friction you have, more easily you can move and the less friction you have on your tool rest, the finer your cuts will be. Right? So we've done this, and you can see that we're starting to get this profile. One question I get is, why don't you just start by cutting the heart on a bandsaw instead of having to go through this motion of these first few steps? That's another method. You could definitely do that. The thing that I don't like about that is when you cut it on a bandsaw, you're going to end up with these 90-degree cuts on the side. And so when you go to make these curved faces, it's kind of a disconnect between this nice curved face and then this just parallel-sided heart. So here is a way that you can get a nice curved profile on the sides that matches the curved profile on the front and the back of the heart. And it takes probably just as much time to do it on the lathe as it does on the bandsaw. Well, it'd be faster with the bottom curve on the bandsaw, but I just like it better. This is my method. Yeah, I guess a lot of times it boils down to, I just like doing it this way better. Nice. We're good tuners, so you know, we need an opportunity to use a lathe instead. And so here when we're getting close, you can kind of hear that now I know I'm at least pretty close to being somewhat rounded. And I'm going to stop believing in just a second. Typically what I'll do is I'll go a little bit deeper on one end, just to give myself a reference for when I'm rounded. So I can see this is rounded. So that's as deep as I want to go for the rest of this heart, right? Or at least the rest of the side profile. Right? And now I know, instead of having to do all these passes, turn off the lathe, go back and forth, and it just cuts out 5 seconds probably, but it's always nice to take a little bit of time. And so I just get this roll, go down to my deep point. Again, using the same thing, keeping my flutes pretty open, so angle that the edge of shooting the do is pretty sheer, right? And you end up with a pretty clean cut. Now if you want to go a little bit more over here, and then just do the original stance, right? Keep the two on the hip and rock back and forth. That's the best. You really want to focus on getting a smooth cut by moving your body instead. So here, it's rounded. I know I don't have any flat spots. And you can't really check this one by putting the tool on it, right? Well, I need to go a little bit further, and then you have a cylinder. Like, where'd my heart go? But I can see that this is rounded, so the last thing I'm going to do is just going to move this a little bit more and do 1 or 2 light passes to clean this up. And then we'll have a nice surface that we can start shaping.
Can I do something, please?
Yes, sir.
Let me just do something here so we can see the outline.
Oh, sure. Here, I've got, let's see, we'll do this. Try this method. This is my copy, so. Let's see. Hold your clipboard.
And that way the clipboard won't jump up and grab something.
Yeah. Well,
If you're in the front row, so we'll take it to the team.
But it'll fly over and hit you.
There we go.
So I'm just worried about
Hey,
it.
Donna,
Yeah, that'd be better.
grab that remote pencil off the top of the lathe.
Oh, thank you. Probably just saved my life. The pencil's gonna go flying in the face.
But if you have your face shield on, you're fine.
That's right. You know, I was hoping that would be part of the demonstration so I could prove the safety of the face shield. There we go. Yeah, good idea. All right, so with this, I'll just do a little bit of a pass, and this is a really nice way to get a clean cut. You drop your tool handle a little bit more, and then you're using this kind of push cut where you're pushing along, and you get a real nice shear angle, like you're using a chisel, a non-wood turning chisel, to slice wood off. Right? And it's a real good way to clean up this edge, and just go slowly, push into the tool rest so you prevent this shatter, and then just go a little bit slow. I'm keeping my index finger against the tool rest, and that tells me that I am doing a pretty uniform cut on the top. And it is one of those cuts that you can still let the bevel. Like I'm touching my bevel, all I have to do is rotate it around, now I'm cutting. But practice it a little bit. This is one of those, the best cut you'll get is the closest one to a catch. And now we've just cleaned up that surface and we have a pretty smooth surface. It's not perfect, you could spend some time in the shop. One thing that I try to do when I'm demonstrating is I don't focus on getting the perfect surface, because we could all go back to our shop and spend another 10 minutes refining the surface for whatever. I'm not gonna sand any here. I don't think it's a good idea to sand during a demonstration. The less dust, the better, right? We don't have a dust extraction. But that's good enough for now. So now what we're going to do is think about actually shaping the profile of this heart. And you can see when I did this, I cut away the sides. Well, I went through all this trouble to draw my heart, and now I don't even have part of it. But that's all right. If you imagine this curve coming out, it's going to be tangent to the outside of my curved block. So you can follow this. And I know that if I'm just imagining right here, this is the width point, my widest point, a third of the way down from the top. If I follow this outward, that's going to be my reference for how wide I want this block to be. So I can just draw this in my mind, and I see that I'm running right where I want to be. So the next step is I'm going to start taking off the top of this. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but we're going to just start making a rough profile of this block. And we'll do some cuts, and I'll do my magic trick and switch to a piece of maple just to speed up the process a little bit and to cut down on the Paduke shavings. You know, I'm never 100% sure that I'm saying it correctly when I say Paduke. I know people say Padock and Paddock, and I think Paduke is right, isn't it? It doesn't really matter. Something I think about
We
too
know what
much.
you're talking about.
Yeah, right. It's red, so there we go. So now I'm going to start by just taking the top off, and then we'll make some cuts down toward the bottom where we want to think about our tenon. So for this, I'm going to use a spindle gouge instead of a bowl gouge. And this is not a Thompson tool. It's one of the cryogenic tools. I think it's Crown, or maybe Henry Tail, I forget. But it's a really nice Crown, thank you. And I like my spindle gouges ground to a pretty aggressive detail profile. And it's just the way that, you know, if I'm trying to get a really nice, smooth curve, I'll use something like a continental gouge that has, you know, or even a spindle roughing gouge can give you a nice curve. When I'm using a spindle gouge, it's all about details and slicing and cutting really efficiently. So I grind it to be a pretty aggressive point. The first time I was doing a demonstration, I bought a new tool. It's the dumbest thing I've ever done as a demonstrator. Like, I'm going to treat myself to a new tool. I didn't grind it at the same profile, and I kept getting these massive catches. It was for my own club, too, so I'm just sweating. I can't believe you guys are going to kick me out. And you know, during the break, somebody came up and like, let me see your tool. And I showed it to them. Like, well, that profile, I had brought my old one, too. That profile is not even close. And I looked at it, and it was just one of those big, oh my gosh, it's not even close. So I was trying to use it this way with a traditional spindle grind, and I kept catching one of the wings, and it was just giving me these god-awful catches. And my first time demonstrating, I was so nervous that didn't help at all. But I like to use this. Spindle gouges are great. It's also always a little bit of when you're going from a bowl gouge to a spindle gouge, so you have to treat them a little bit differently. So even with this pretty aggressive grind, you know, you can still focus on rubbing the bevel and just lifting it up. Get a nice cut. So we're just going to start cutting, and you can see on the monitor, this is my high point, or my wide point. So I'm just going to start moving off the corners. And with this, kind of doing the ABCs, anchor, bevel, cut. Right, rotating the tool around as I get a little closer. And I'm just not focusing on doing a perfect curve right now. You can see it being a little bit of chatter because I'm going, you know, kind of hard over. Right, but all I'm doing is just approaching that wide point. Getting that loosen and finish. Making a nice curve toward the top. Right. So now I have this okay curve. You can see a couple of divots, and that's fine for now. Right, but I have my widest point set. I can still see that line. The nice thing about drawing on the face is when that's spinning, I have my line I can see, and I'm not interfering with it being drawn on the sides and I'm cutting away, for example. So now I'm going to start taking away wood from the bottom. So this will be the top of my heart. This will be the bottom of my heart. And this is going to be where my tenon is for the next couple sets. Same sort of thing, just start moving away at the corners. And all we're doing at this point is just removing wood. Right, nothing fancy, we're just removing wood, and see if we kind of go pretty fast. And start moving away. And then on one, you have made a lot of these hearts, so kind of know how much I want to trade in. But ultimately what we're going to do is we're keeping our high point. And then we need to save enough wood for a tenon on the bottom, right? But of course, at the very end, we're not going to have a heart with a tenon or you know, a pedestal style foot on it, right? So when I'm making this curve, at least initially, I'm trying to think of where it's going to end when I'm doing my final shaping cuts. And so here, I'm kind of going to where you can imagine following this curve, it's going to end right around here. But ultimately, I need to be a little bit more aggressive with that. Right? But I do want to save enough wood for a tenon. So we'll just make a few more cuts, and I'll start getting down to the point of having a tenon. And then we'll switch to this maple, my magic trick. I'll do some magic instead. All right, so we'll make a couple more cuts right here. going down. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. Something like this, and you can just start shaving it over, right? So that is pretty good. Doesn't like a slinger like that. So you down there. So if we do this, I'm going to keep as much mass at the bottom as possible. So I'm not going to worry about doing a nice refining cut. And I'll keep a pretty nice chunk of wood on the bottom. Right. And so this is kind of the point where I said at a certain point I'll have something that looks a little bit more like a hot air balloon than hard, and that's what we have right here. It's a hot air balloon, right? So when I'm making my tenon, you can use whatever tool that you want. I've got jaws with 50 millimeter jaws, and so I'll set my size. But a lot of times, what I'll do is you can eye a tenon and be right 99% of the time, but sometimes it's best to have some calipers, and I just use these cheap vernier calipers, and I've had them forever. I've lost these screws a couple times, and through some miracle, I found them in my shavings in my shop, and I don't keep my shop clean. It's kind of embarrassing, but I've always found these screws, and so I really haven't learned my lesson yet. But anyway, so I'll set this at right now it's set at 55 millimeters or so, and as it's going, we'll just do this. You want to make sure that your face is pretty square. If it's not, you're going to have a lot of chatter with your calipers. So I'll just press in. I don't know how well you can see that on the camera. And do this. And it's a really quick way to inscribe the size of your tenon in a place where it might be more difficult to get something like dividers in. This would be a little bit more challenging for an angle than just using these small calipers. If you've never done this before, this is where I'm talking to everyone, and most of you have probably done something like this before. If you haven't, it can look a little bit unnerving, almost like if you're sizing with a parting tool, and that tool is going to catch and it's going to fly into my face or my body. But yeah, exactly. And oh gosh, some of my worst experiences when I was first starting out were parting tool accidents. Just you're not scared because you don't know what you don't know, but looking back, yeah, it's amazing that nothing actually happens. Right, but you want to be sure that you're only touching the front points, right? And then what I'm doing is I'm making a little bit of a press on my front points, and when it lines up with my back points, I know that I have the tenon that's whatever size that I set, right? So then let me switch to a different piece of wood. So now I know that this is the size tenon that I'm making. You can use a skew or whatever, badan, spindle gouge, bowl gouge, whatever tool you want to size your tenon correctly. But just for the sake of speeding things up a little bit, let's do this little magic trick. Perhaps I know what you would.
Should we close our eyes?
Yeah, turn the camera feed off too. So I've got a piece of maple, soft maple. So it's not the best wood, but it's good enough. And I've done exactly the same process. I've just gone through, and I've done a little bit more refining cuts, but maybe spent just a few more minutes on this, and then size the tenon to be appropriately sized. So as you're going, and I'll put this in check in just a little bit. What I've also done is I've created a little shoulder here for my tenon. Instead of having this curved surface that goes down to my tenon, keeping a shoulder allows you to have this nice flat shoulder for the jaws to press on, and it gives you a little bit less wobble. And I usually use a shoulder for anytime I'm making a tenon. I make sure to keep a shoulder, except for really specific circumstances. And it also gives you a little bit more freedom. If you mess up the size of your tenon, you have some extra wood where you can try again if you need to. Right? So we're going to take this and I'm going to put them into my jaws, my check jaws. And the reason I'm doing that is now we're going to there we go. Not sure if we need this for the maple. It should be a little bit brighter. We'll put it back on if we need to. But we're going to make a hole at the top, and this is going to be a hole that when we start cutting away the face will reveal the lobes of the heart. But we need to make a bowl, so we can't keep our heart between centers. We can try to do that, but let's see, where is this?
All the way over.
Oh, thank you. so when you're making this bowl, and it's really just a little cavity, with these hearts, I like to make them into little bud bases or weed bases, so they have some sort of a function for them, and that's not important, but I always think it's nice to have an optional function, to a piece. I don't think it detracts from it being an art piece, if that's what you're going with, but it's cool to have that option. And it's also kind of a nice thing if you want to display some flowers in a heart-shaped vase. That's pretty cool. But it is an end grain bowl that we're going to be making. So with end grain, it can be a little bit more challenging if you're not used to it, right? But it's really not that bad. And when I started turning, I hated doing end grain work, and now I think I like it more than face grain for a variety of reasons that aren't important. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take our heart, put it in our chuck jaws, and then start making a little bowl. And I'll talk about things to consider when we're doing that. Magic trick done. Ta-da! That's amazing. I'll tell you my secret afterward how I did that.
I know, it's dyed.
That's right, it is. It was maple all along. I just put some acetone on it when we were looking. So we've got this heart that's spinning, and I'm going to make a bowl right here. And so one thing that I'll do is, if you find that you're getting a little bit off center, and sometimes that happens, I will just take my left center and just center it up, and then come down on this a little bit. For hollowing like this, you can use a variety of tools, and most of us love tools. If you don't like tools, you're probably in the wrong craft. But tools are awesome. There are specialized tools. There are tools that make things a lot easier. But at the end of the day, you can do most things with a pretty simple tool kit. So what I'm going to do is I'll just make this this bowl with a little bowl gouge, but I do have something. I don't know if you guys have ever used a hunter tool, which is a really nice cup carbide. Doing end grain work, end grain bowls, or whatever, you can get a really smooth off the tool surface with this cup carbide tool, because you can follow the bevel as you're pulling out. It's pretty nice. But if you don't have this, doesn't mean you can't do this. So I'm just going to use a bowl gouge for this process. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'll just drill a little pilot hole with a Jacob's chuck and a 1/2-inch brad point drill bit. And this is always a good thing. I think it makes it a little bit easier when doing end grain work to have a little pilot hole. Right? And it's just a tiny little time saver. And really, you can make a pilot hole or plug with a spindle gouge pretty easily. But since we have a drill bit, why not do that? When you're drilling on the lathe, speeds don't have to be high at all. So this is running 600 RPMs. That's totally fine, right? And sometimes this is a really cheap Jacob's chuck, so it doesn't put the drill bit on center sometimes. So you can just move this a little bit with your hand. And what I've done, I didn't talk about this. I have this center point of my life center that created a little divot here, and then I expanded that just a tiny little bit with a skew, so I have a reference point for my brad point. How many times can you say point in a sentence? And that keeps this point on center, and as long as you start this on center, and it just so happens that the cup on my life center is a 1/2 inch, so I know that that's going to line up with the cutting blades on my brad point. If I start this on center, and I go slowly, it's really going to minimize that kind of strain you get sometimes with a longer drill bit like this. And so I'm just going to go slow, and you want to watch to make sure your shavings are feeding out. Usually at home, I'll just kind of do this and blow out with my air compressor at the same time. But when you start to see that I'm getting this pile up, that's when you can just glue it to a rest bag, clear it out. You can blow into it if you need to, and then go back in. And as long as I'm going slowly and I'm keeping my shavings clear, my drill bit's going to stay on track. Most of the time when you have a problem where you're doing this wobble with the drill and you're creating a lot of friction, it's because you're going too fast or you didn't start on center. And I've seen these horror pictures of people using these nice expensive bits because they think they're going to drill these really nice holes with a more expensive bit, and it snaps off. Like, I just paid $60 for one grad point bit, and it broke on me. That bit sucks. Well, it wasn't the bit, it was because you were just trying to go fast, or the speed was at like 1,000, 1,500 RPMs, and they're just going fast. This was a pretty cheap grad point bit, a really cheap Jacob's check, and as long as I'm going slowly and taking the time to clear out, then everything's going to stay on center. Or I'll do just a little bit more. You can take the time to measure this if you want to, but I know that based on the size of this heart and the size of my drill bit, if I just go pretty much to where the flutes meet the body of the shaft of the drill bit, that is deep enough. And it's deep enough in the context of I'm not going through the bottom of my heart. That would be the biggest disaster. And it's also deep enough to where when I have my hole or my bowl that I make, you won't be able to see the bottom of the drill hole. It'll just look like a little cavern, and that gives you enough room for if you're actually using this like a bud base for your stems to go in and not tip over or anything like that. So we've got a hole, and the only thing we did that for was to make a little pilot hole for our hollowing. Right? So I'm going to use, I said I'm not a tool loyalist, but here I am with another Thompson tool and a big Thompson on the handle. In fact, this was one of the first tools I ever bought, and I think or first handles I ever bought, and it was great. I felt so cool being able to customize and write something on the handle, and I think it's a little bit goofy now, but it's like looking a little bit at my turning history. So this is a 3/8 inch bull gouge, again, sweat back grind, and it's really sharp. The smaller the tool, the more, so a little bit counterintuitive, the smaller the tool, the more aggressive you can be when you're hollowing because you have a smaller surface that's cutting, but it works really great for something like this. So end grain, I'm going to start just pulling the wood. Now you can treat this like a side grain, just go in and move from the out to from the outer diameter to the inner diameter as you're moving down. You'll end up with a lot of tear outs, but you can always go back and do some pull cuts to clean that up, right? But for the sake of this, I'm just going to make some stepped cuts. I'll pull outward, 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 and then doing this, making sure that my cutting point is right on center, and I like to have it so my handle's slightly lifted up. If you're doing this and your handle's dipping down, that really introduces the possibility of a catch. Keeping your handle above center gives you a nice fine cutting angle, plus you can really close your flute and get some nice shear cutting on the inside of a bowl this way. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to make some cuts, and this goes relatively quickly, but one thing to consider here is when we're making this end grain bowl, or this little hollow, is we want to try to transition that upper point, or the top of our bowl, into this curve that we've made with our heart. So we want smooth, continuous curves. So I'm going to make this, if you can imagine, we had this X-ray vision, and we're looking down here. My bowl is going to be about this deep right here, and it'll be shaped sort of like a triangle. It'll have a slight OG curve to it. So I'm coming like this, and then as I get toward the lip, I'm going to start coming outward. And you have this nice flare. We can really connect the curves from the outside to the inside. Right? So let's do that. I'll stop talking about it. I'll actually start doing it. Right, so we're going to turn the speed up. Not crazy fast, but back to about where we had it, 1160 or so, and we're going to start pulling, right? So this is all we're doing. You do want to be a little bit careful. Anytime the mass of your object is quite a bit bigger than the size of your tendon, you don't want to use a whole lot of lateral force because you just introduce a lot of chatter and the potential that something's going to happen. Right? But all I'm doing is I'm just pulling. And as I'm pulling to the side, I'm pulling slightly outward. Right? And you can be more aggressive with this. You open up your flute, it's going to be more aggressive. Have a tighter grip with your right hand to prevent anything from happening. But if you close it, you get nice, finer surface cuts. Right? But as we're going, we're just pulling out. And this is about as deep as I'm going to go with my tool. So now I can focus on making this transition. Right, so as I'm doing this, it's a little bit of a wood turner stance. You can't see super clearly. I'm starting with my tools somewhat open, and as I'm pulling, I'm just closing it slightly and lifting it up a little bit more. So I'm starting somewhat aggressively, just to not have much chatter on the inside with that drill hole. And I'm just pulling this and transitioning into sort of like a shear straight. And what that's going to do, it's going to give me this nice transition to my outside curve. This is somewhat of a design choice. You can make this good shape however you want. The reason I'm doing sort of an OG curve to this is when we start going from our current hot air balloon shape to a heart shape, by having an OG profile, I think it gives you the best looking lobes to your heart. Now, how wide do you need to make your bowl? Typically, I will do this, and good, I love the camera setup, this is great. My club has none of this. We have, it's like somebody donated their old camcorder, and somebody donated their own, I don't know, we're getting better. But every time I come to a setup like this, it's awesome. But when I'm doing this, I want to make sure that I'm not cutting away the top, right? So I'm keeping this flat right here, but I'm also ending kind of the deep part of my bowl, maybe about a 1/4 inch from, or where I start to flare out in that top OG flare, about a 1/4 of an inch through maybe 5/16 of an inch away from the edge. And that's enough to where when I start cutting away this surface, it dips down pretty well. If I have this really, say like imagine a rice bowl shaped bowl on the inside, when I start cutting away the surface, that bowl that's shaped like this is going to reveal this really, really deep profile, and you kind of move to like an upside down Star Trek insignia, like that triangular thing, instead of a heart, not a heart. That would be kind of cool too. But this gives me a nice, gentle curve that hopefully, hopefully the plan works out. So we'll see. Make just a couple more cuts, and then I see that there's a little sharp profile right here. And I'll just shear cut that away. Okay, so here, rotating my flute so it's closed, dropping my handle, or dropping my cutting surface a little bit, now I have this really, really nice shear scrape. And even with something like soft maple, you can get a pretty nice surface off the tool without having to rely on something like a ring tool or that Hunter Badger. I think sometimes having optional tools is fun just because you get to use a different tool. But this is a really, really smooth surface. I never like to use those statements, well, you can start sanding at 400, it'll be perfect, because somebody's going to say, well, that's a little bit of tear out right there. But you can start sanding at a higher grit than you might think that you would be able to using a bull gouge on end grain. Right? So it's pretty nice. So I'm just going to make a couple more cuts just to smooth out this transition. And I'm doing, again, keeping my flute pretty closed, handle up, just making some shear cuts. Now this, you can hear a little bit of chatter, you can see that as well. And that's because I'm not perfectly, and this just a tiny, tiny little bit of play from going between centers to my check jaws. But I have a nice transition right there. I can do this knowing that I'm touching continuous wood. If I go out here, I put my finger here, you guys will see a little bit of blood, and I'll try to spare you that. Kind of one of my, you always like to talk about your mistakes, right? And I was doing a demonstration on another thing once for a club in I think this was in Virginia, and I was pointing out something, and I was trying to get real slick and point really close to where I needed to, and I hit the check jaws and just spinning in the middle of my demo. And you want to pretend like nothing happened, so I just kept going, and so I looked down on the ground, there's a little drop of blood. I'm like, oh my gosh, somebody's going to see that. And so somebody gave me a Band-Aid really quickly, and I was holding up the demo piece at the very end. I was covering the blood that was on it in my palms. Like, yeah, look, you did a good job. And that was one of those life lessons. All right, if you're pointing at something, maybe take an extra step to think about what you're pointing at and what's spinning at you. Right. So we've got this heart, and we have a pretty nice transition. There's a little bit of a lip right here that we can refine, and we'll do that in the next step. So we've got our bowl. We're going to put this back between centers to turn away our tenon and kind of get that final curve shape for our heart, and then we'll start doing the face grain work. After I put this between centers, we'll do a little bit more refining. We could take a break, and you guys like to take a break, and however long you take a break for, and then we'll come back. We'll do our face grain stuff, and it should be pretty good timing. So let's take this out of the chuck jaws. And any questions or anything right now while I'm doing this menial task? And yeah, like I said with the handouts, if you think of anything, or if you want to try to make a heart afterward, if you haven't done this before, then send me some pictures. I would love to see that. But if you get stuck on a point and you're like, I'm not sure what you did here, so there are a couple things I would do differently than what's in the handouts. I'm always happy to talk about wood turning, so just let me know. So it's just an opportunity to talk about wood turning even more. All right, so I'm going to put my center in. I use a step center for this instead of like a spur drive, so it doesn't go quite as deep here. And, you know, I'm doing this. I started with this 6x6 block. And I want to make sure that my center point doesn't go too deep into the heart, because ultimately we're going to cut it so that the bottom of the heart doesn't reveal that hole from the center point. Right, so the least aggressive thing, you could use a little cup center or safety drive, and that would probably be even better, but it wouldn't give you as much security when you're roughing out the rectangle or the block from the start. So here, how are we going to put this between centers? Well, my life center and any other life center, or you can use a cone center or whatever, I'm just going to put a little cone attachment to it, and that will fit right into my nice cavity. This is another reason I like to make sort of an OG-shaped bowl instead of a rice bowl shape, is so this fits my cone pretty well, right? And I don't have a lot of pressure just on my my drilled portion. But I also don't want to mar my surface, so all I do is I just take a little bit of shop towel. You can use whatever. You can use rubber chuckies, nice silicone, you can use wood, whatever. This is just what I have and what I like to use. So I'll just put a little bit of a shop towel over this. I'm cheating, it's a kitchen towel, it's not a shop towel, so don't judge me. But over this, and I ran out of shop towels earlier this week. Can you believe that? Unbelievable. So I had to beg my wife to let me take a kitchen towel here. I'm just kidding. My wife is awesome. If she ever sees this recording, she is the best thing that's ever happened to me. And I'm sort of joking, but it's also true. She is really supportive, and you know, we have two very young kids. I have a 1.5-year-old and a 3+-year-old at home, and she's watching them solo right now. They're in daycare, so weekends are always like a jungle when it's just them. And you know, I'm really grateful that she's supportive of this, and yeah, I can't thank her enough. I don't thank her enough, and I should be better about that. So now we've got this between centers, putting it in this cone that's on, or this hollow that's on center. I'm using that same center point, so I know I'm switching back between centers and chucks. Even if I don't have my center point anymore, it's still true. And it's going to be spinning, and I can make my cuts that continue this profile without having to reshape completely. All right, so let's do that. Then, like I said, we can refine this little bit right here. You can see that lip on the camera. That's just a little bit sharp, so I'll just make a couple of cuts to do that. Again, without being completely anal about this. Go back to my spindle gouge, and I'll start turning away this tenon, right? And then we'll take a break. So speed. That's about where we were. Turned it up a little bit, but it's 1200. It doesn't really matter too much. So let's start doing this. I'm going to drop this a little bit. Anytime you're moving your tool rest with the lathe on, be very, very, very careful. So all we're doing is just making these light cuts. Turning away my tenon. And this is the point where you want to make sure that you don't have to go back to your bowl or anything like this. Once you turn away your tenon, that's it. Right? You can't put it back on that same, you can't mount in the chuck jaws in the same way without some sort of clever solution. So So the first thing that I'm doing is I am just imagining how deep my center point is within my wood. This doesn't go too deep, but it's still maybe like 3/16 of an inch into my wood. And when I'm finishing my heart, I don't want a hole on the bottom unless I was mounting it in a specific way. I made this one to look kind of like a balloon. So I have a 1/4 inch hole drilled, so it doesn't matter if I have a hole on the bottom. But typically, I want the bottom of the heart to be a point. I think it just looks best that way. Right, so I want to imagine how deep that is. I don't want to cut all the way. So let's say that my heart is going to have this curve that goes down to a little bit further. Sometimes it's easier to switch hands when you're kind of cramped. It's a good skill to have, to be able to turn left-handed and right-handed. Takes a little bit of time to build that ambidextrous skill set, but it can save you quite a bit of trouble and awkwardness. Sometimes turning right-handed over here, you have to get into this position that's not safe. All right, so I've got that. That's pretty good. You can see there's a little bit of a hump right here that we can refine, but all I'm going to do is just focus on this, use my spindle gallow just like a scraper, and I'll just close my flute, lift up my handle a little bit, and try to get a nice little transition there. You want to be, especially with kind of an aggressive grind like this, be aware of where your point is, and really focus on kind of shaving back and forth, moving your hips. And now we've eliminated that sharp point. Right, we have this really nice curve. You could spend some time refining it, but it's pretty nice. And that curve that goes into our bowl, I know that since we took the time to make the bowl of a specific shape, that's going to come out at a really gentle angle and transition really well into this side curve like this. And all we'll do, I'll make 1 or 2 more cuts and we'll take this break. Right? So I've got this little bulge right here, and you can see it a little bit. This is one of the things that if I was at home in my shop, I would probably stare at this for 5 minutes. What can I do? Get a ruler out sometimes and see if there's light coming in the ruler. But you can also just feel it. I'm not looking at this, you can feel it. And I get really anal about that stuff. I won't show that side of me while I'm here, but let's just make a couple cuts. This is also going to be a way to get a little bit closer to that point. Right, I like my curve right here. It's going really nicely until about right here. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to spindle gouge. You can just ABCs, right? I'm not doing anything but cutting, and I can try to get my bearings right. But all I'm doing is just going to lift up my handle a little bit, go slowly, and as I'm transitioning into the bottom, I'm just lifting this up and continue lifting up my tool. And now I'm doing this nice cut right here. There's a little bit of a hump. You just pick up that cut. I love that sound. Just nice shavings coming off of a sharp tool is just, it's a great visual, but man, the sound is also so nice too. Blue train is, it's just the best. Right, so I can do this, and you can do, this is one of those things, you take it as a personal challenge sometimes in your shop, like how close can I get to cutting this off? Now, at a demo, I'm not going to do that, but you do this and keep going. It's also kind of a nice thing to keep a little bit of meat on this, right? So there's one more little hump. Let's do this, and then I'll actually. There we go. That's good enough. So it tells me that it wants to stop. All right. So now the next step after our break, we will start working on the face grain work, and this, even though there's that tiny little hump right here, this is, so I'm starting to show that anal side of me. Let's trash it. No, I'm just kidding. You can always work this out with sandpaper. You're never going to get this perfectly smooth surface. There's always divots. And at the bottom end or the back end of this project, just take a couple minutes and you can transition that. You know, sandpaper is another tool. It is another cutting tool as long as you haven't been using the same piece of sandpaper for years. I always love the phrase, use sandpaper like somebody else is paying for it. And absolutely. So I could spend, you could spend 10 minutes trying to refine this perfectly, or spend 2 minutes with some 120 grit, 150 grit sandpaper getting a nice curved surface. Right, so let's go ahead and take a break. You guys can probably, I love that the bathroom's right there.
Yep.
And then we'll come back and we'll work on the face crane and make the heart instead of the hot air balloon. All right, there we go, back on. Hey, welcome back. All right, so now we've got our heart shape, and we're going to focus on. So we're done with the spindle orientation turning, and we're going to do some face crane turning again to turn this hot air balloon into a heart. And so using the layouts and the holes that we scribed in or indented in before, we're going to start out by putting this between centers. And I used to do this a little bit differently. This is one of the major differences between what's in the handout and what we're going to do today. Previously, I would try to, I don't have a joiner at home, and I wish I did. It would be useful for a heck of a lot of things, but I just don't have one. And if I could join these faces, and I do have a planer, but without a joiner, you can't really ensure that it's perfectly, whatever, I won't get into that. But I used to do something where I would just jam this against like a flat surface and then turn a tenon right here. The problem with that is, we spent so much time getting these holes to be as close to the same reference point as possible that when you do this and then you start turning it, you never get it perfectly right. But if you stick between centers and make your first tenon, that ensures that when you flip this around, you're as close as possible, and you really just are ensuring symmetry. Right, so we're going to start out between centers instead of in the handouts putting this against a flat surface. And I think it's just a better method overall. And we're not being too aggressive with this. Theoretically, you could complete the entire heart between centers, and then you wouldn't have to worry about flipping it back and forth. You could just work on the left side and the right side. And I think that would work pretty well if you had a spindle extension. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to get in here, but then at the end you have to worry about sanding off the little nubs, and this is just a way that you can cut out a little bit of time. Right, so we're going to start between centers, and I'm going to use my bull gouge again to make a tenon. Right. And let's see, make sure.
Here.
All right, you can hear me all right again? Mm-hmm. Perfect. So now again, we're face crane turning now, so you have to kind of switch your approach. Whereas, I was finding a little wood there, I got a bit of nail, but we'll sand that away at the end. But when I'm doing spindle turning, right, downhill is supported crane. Here, we're going to go this way. We're going to just take a different approach. But first thing, we're going to make a little tenon right here, and that'll allow us to check it up, and then we'll go from there. Just like before, you want to make sure that you have this piece that's spinning. You want to make sure that you're not going to hit anything. And the first thing that I do before I make my tenon is I'm just going to surface this so that it's flat right here. And it's pretty flat already, but just to make sure you can see there's a tiny little bit of wobble right there. It shows up really well on the camera. But all we're going to do, again, just keep the handle up a little bit, close the flute, and just make some passes like this. And if you find that you're getting a lot of shadow right here, you can just go in a little bit and just move it away. And then that's going to just give you a little bit more security when you're doing these spacing cuts. But we're not going to be too anal with it. Like this. There we go. You really don't need to finish the entire surface, just where your tenon is going to be. Right. So that's what we're going to do. Now I've got my same calipers set at 55. 52 to 55 is a nice sweet spot. All right, I'm going to do the same thing, making sure I'm only touching the point that's closest to me. And let's see if you can see that. All right. Okay, cool. So when I'm doing that, I'm just making some really, really light touches. So if I'm over here, for example, and I put my form in, I can see that I'm nowhere close. Maybe put it on this face if you can, right here, on the tailstock side. Right. If I'm too far away, you can see that this point that I'm making is nowhere near close to my other point. So you want to make sure that they line up pretty well. Now I know I have this scribe that is, let's say, 54.5 millimeters. But who's counting? Right. So now I've got this, and you don't have to turn the lathe off, but here we're just going to make a little tenon, and I made this little mark right here. It kind of worked out perfectly. I shouldn't say that I accidentally stumbled on this, but I'm going to make a shoulder that's about as wide as the space between these two lines. All right, so let's make our tenon, make a tiny little shoulder, start making some cuts, and I'm going to switch this out for this next step piece of maple right here, just to cut out a little bit of time, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So what we're doing here, I don't want to make too many cuts, I just want to make enough space for my tenon and my shoulder. So I'm kind of holding a 45-degree face, and I'm just cutting and pushing toward the tailstock with this. You don't have to have a very deep tenon. Right. You can get away. Now your tenon doesn't have to be as long as possible. An 1/8 of an inch tenon is a lot stronger than we think it's going to be. Right? So we'll do that for a little bit. And then we've got this nice shoulder. And what I usually do is I'll clean this up with, you can use a skew, but whatever I'm going to do, I'll just take my spindle gouge and clean this up a little bit, just putting the bevel on, just rotating with my hips pretty easily. And that's going to give me this nice clean face to my tenon. And then I'm just going to do this. It's a little bit challenging to see the angle. There we go. Now I'm going to have a pretty good shoulder, I have a good tenon, everything's pretty clean. You can see these nice little shavings right here. I love these too. Looks like a little coral, almost. A coral polyp. And I have a good tenon. So that's all I need to do right there. So I'm going to flip this around. And we'll switch to this one that's a little bit further ahead. But I would flip this around, put it in my chuck jaws, turn another tenon on the other side. And the reason, aside from just keeping everything straight according to my reference points, is I like to have something in the chuck because it gives you a little bit more security when you're making some aggressive cuts than if you were just between centers. Especially with a step center, you can see that there's only so much pressure it can take before you start spinning in the wood. So let me put my chuck on, and I'm going to put this piece of maple in. No magic trick here, I just kind of did a time skip, which is a whole different thing. And I'll talk about this once I'm surprised. I don't know if you guys have this problem in your shops, and also when I demonstrate, I think they follow me. I have these gremlins that follow me where I'll put a tool down and something unseen, I don't know what happens, they come back and steal my tool, move it to a completely different space, and I spend 5 minutes searching for something I just laid down. I haven't had that problem yet, which is great. So I'm going to put my chuck on, put this in the chuck jaws, and I'm going to put it in like this, and I'll switch it around, and we'll start making these cuts to make a curve on our face. I always like to do a little bit of snap. This is kind of find that's a controversial topic, to snap or to not snap your chuck on the jaws, and I like to do it. It gives me some security. I'm always trying to make sure that with anything else, everything's clean. The mating surface between your chuck and your spindle is clean, free of dust, and you prevent as much wobble or run out as possible. That's another sort of thing. If you find that you're going from between centers, and when you put something in your chuck jaws and it's kind of running out quite a bit, a lot of times it's because you have a little bit of dust on one side of your mating face, and surprisingly, the tiniest little bit of dust can not ruin a project, but make it quite a bit more challenging. Right, so here, let's imagine that I had that block in here and I was working on this, and I'll do the same thing I'm going to talk about on this side, right, I have made this curved face. I have my shoulder, and I have my tendon, and I've started to make this curve all the way to this point that was the remnant of what I had in my step center. And by keeping that, instead of, what I used to do is I would have this, and I would just cut this off with a chisel or something and then end up at this point. The problem with that is it's hard to see exactly where the middle of your step center is, or that the remnant is, we'll call that. Right, so by keeping that point right there, I know that when I'm facing this surface, I can aim for this point, and when I cut all the way to that center pin hole, right, I'm exactly halfway across the width of my heart. Right? So what I did with this is I just did that, and I missed it a little bit, but I was aiming for this tiny little hole that would have been here, and that's my stopping point. So it gives me a reference for how continuous I want this curve to be. Right? So now we're actually going to do this instead of talking about this. So I'm going to flip this around. If I would have taken that, I would have put it in my jaws, made another tendon, started this curve. But let's make this curve on the other side of this block. And those gremlins, sometimes they're sometimes they're not. Another benefit of keeping a shoulder, especially with something like this, is I've made this, I've worked to make this really nice curve. And if I've curved all the way down to where my tendon is, then I don't have a mating surface for my chuck jaws to mate on. Right? And you can introduce a little bit of wobbling. You can sort of prevent that by really cranking down on your chuck jaws, but that introduces other problems. By keeping a shoulder until the very end, I know that I'm going to have this nice clean surface, and I'm going to have this nice stable connection between my wood and my lathe. So now, I'm going to do this same thing. We're just going to start taking off this corner, removing wood, and then we'll just remove some wood, and then we'll focus on making this really nice curve. I'm going to keep tailstock support for a little bit, even though you don't have to. I find that maybe, if nothing else, it's good mental reassurance when you're working far away from the tool and you have a shorter tendon that's strong enough but shorter. It's nice to know that nothing's going to happen with tailstock support when we're making these first aggressive cuts. So we're going to use my 1/2 inch bowl gouge again, and I'm just going to start making some cuts right here, and then I'll take away the tailstock when we start refining that curved surface. So again, you want to make sure that you're not hitting anything. Always a good idea, just a good practice to stand out of the line of fire, especially when, well, if you can, completely stay out of the line of fire. But especially when you're starting off, turning on your lathe, move out of the lane. Because that's when something's going to happen that you don't know about when you first start it up and turn up the speed. Right. When it's going and it's secure, well, then just be careful anyway. And so I'm going to drop my tool rest just a tiny, tiny little bit. And then start cutting off this corner. And then we'll start refining our curve. So you want to be really careful right here. And this is a point where you have a lot of interrupted cuts. So what I mean by interrupted cuts is as this part's spinning around, I'm cutting wood, air, wood, air, wood, air. And as you get really close to the end right here, you're cutting about 10% wood and 90% air. Right? So you want to be really conscious of where the tip of your tool is, and just really slow. These robust tool rests are pretty nice for something like this. You have a nice curve where you can put the meat of your hand on and really stabilize your wrist and your hand. And all I'm doing is I'm using my pinky to pull this tool for me, toward me. I'm keeping it stable, secure. I'm anchoring the tool on my hip at the same time. I'm getting really fine control. Because all I'm doing is just moving my pinky. That's it. Right. But as we're doing that, we're also going to think about this. So I've got my shoulder right here. I don't want to cut that at this point. And I know that when I'm thinking about my final curve, it's going to curve through where my shoulder is. Right? So that's going to be my high point right now. But I'm imagining this, if my heart is curving through my shoulder, this shoulder, not this shoulder, right? I want to make sure that I have enough depth on my shoulder to continue this curve. And it sounds a little bit weird, but if I had a really shallow shoulder and I worked so hard to get this nice curve, then as I meet my shoulder, I get a flat spot. and it just doesn't turn out really nicely. So now, we're just going to start thinking about making these refinement cuts. Right, I cut to about the depth that I needed right here, and I'm just going to just make a piston cut and draw my tool outward. So here, instead of using my pinky, right, since I'm focusing on getting a nice continuous curve that kind of spans a pretty long distance, I'm moving my hips instead. The pinky was just for removing the wood. The hip really helps you get a smooth, controlled cut. And as I'm looking at this, right, so there's that point I'm cutting out of there. The problem with this is if I'm not anchoring my hand with my tool to the tool rest, I get a lot of chatter. You can just see that. Right. Now as you move toward the edge, you get a lot of chatter. So right here, as we're making these nice, smooth, refining cuts, pull cuts, right, great. We're going to take a step back. I'm going to take away the tailstock, and we're going to start thinking about this final curve, right, or the bottom curve. Right, because this is going to be the real critical point, what your bottom looks like. You don't want a heart that has this nice curve coming from the center, and then all of a sudden you change the speed of the curve. And what I mean by the speed of the curve is kind of like you're changing the slope of the line. If I have this nice gentle curve, and now it goes like this, it's going to look kind of funky. So I want to make sure that you can see this on the camera, that this side has a nice continuous curve all the way from where my center is, all the way to the tip. But right here I've got this point. Right, sorry about that. And you guys want to see my face shield, how dusty it is? So I want to focus on getting rid of this point and transitioning this curve through that point. And you can see this in your mind, like, I just need to cut like this. But we're going to do that. And the only way that you can do that really nicely is by taking light controlled passes. I'll keep my tool rest pretty close. And I'm going to try to angle my tool rest in a way that represents the direction of my curve. Right? That way I don't have to fiddle back and forth and change it. I know that if my tool rest is right here and I'm imagining this curve like this, I can keep my tool rest in the same spot, get nice support from my tool, and create this nice continuous curve. So let's do that. I'll get this out of the way. Keep that in there for now. And again, we're not tailstock support, so just make sure that you're out of the line of fire. So here, we'll just do some push cuts, right? So instead of pull cuts, we're just doing push cuts, and that'll give us a nice clean surface where we can really start focusing on this way. I can see that point, okay. So we're just making real light cuts right here. So I put the bevel on so you can see that we're really not cutting a whole lot of wood. Okay. But smooth, controlled, light passes. And I'm trying to be really careful right here, because this is the point where if you're going to have a lot of chip outs, this is going to be it. Right? So you want to make sure that your tool is anchored to the tool rest pretty well. So now I'm cutting off that little remnant, and I can see I still have...
Hold on. Can we reposition the top?
Oh, yes.
I think we rotated to the point where we're getting your helmet and not getting the...
There we go. Okay, I can try to stand back as well.
Okay, yeah, if you don't mind. That'd be good. All right.
Yeah, thank you. I try to be aware of the monitor, but sometimes you get a little bit of tunnel vision, right? So now all I'm doing is I'm cutting away this point, right? Yeah, we're just kind of moving at this point, but now I know that if I just keep a little bit of bevel support, and I follow this, then I'm pretty close to center. I've got a little bit left to do. You can kind of see this, this flat spot right there. Right? So we're just going to make one or two more passes just to get that tip pointed, and then we'll make a few more pull cuts to blend this curve in, and then we'll focus on cleaning off our tendons. I wonder if I can put this piece of paper back underneath it. A little bit. And I'm going to keep my face shield out of the way. Cool, thanks, Larry.
Got it.
All right, Larry.
All right, just a couple more light cuts. Remember, we're just getting this tiny, tiny little quarter right here. The dropping handle, the smallest, the most delicate cuts. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Just like that big failure that we made. No, I'm just kidding. Just like the little hump that I was focusing on a little bit much. You can always blend things with sandpaper if it's not perfect. That's a good phrase. Yeah. So that is probably good enough. Right there, so you can see, I don't know how well it comes across. Yeah, there we go. So now we have this nice curve, a couple of little flat spots, right? But we ended the curve right at that sharp point. And no matter how much you focus on this heart on the previous steps when you're in spindle orientation, you're going to have a little bit of a remnant left that you can just carve away with a little knife to refine that point in the final finishing stages. So all we have to do now is just blend this curve that we made and get rid of these tiny little humps. And that just takes some pull cuts, and that's it. And then we'll turn off this tenon, turn this around, and finish off our heart. Okay. Now this is where, kind of going to fire right now, but I'm making pretty delicate cuts. I'm keeping my foot pretty closed and just drawing across. Now you can get out of the line of fire and use your left hand, but you don't have those good vantage points. Now I'm kind of switching between looking at the top and looking at the bottom. I'm looking at the bottom quite a bit because it's easier to see the ghost. Right? But either way, you don't have to get in the line of fire. Right? So I find that I'm just right-handed by nature, and I'm a little bit more control with my right hand. So right here, as I'm doing this, instead of keeping my flute closed when I move to the end, I'm opening it up just very, very, very slightly. Right? And what that does is that puts a little bit less pressure on the wood and allows me to take a nice, really, really fine cut. I'm pushing down on the press as I'm doing this, so that way my tool's not going to catch. And I'm getting these beautiful shaping. This is where I was talking about lathe therapy. Gosh, if I feel mad, angry, I'm toddlers, so it's kind of every day for me now. And I'll let them put this on camera. I love my children more than anything, even turning. Sometimes more than my wife. Cut that. It's a different kind of love, but if I'm just feeling frustrated, I usually work quite a bit at nights in the shop, but I'll just come out and I'll just take a block of wood and make nice little wispy sheared shavings, and it's just such a nice thing. All right, so we've got this, and let's just do a couple more passes, take this off, and we'll switch it around. So we've got a pretty nice curve, and ultimately when we're doing at this point, you have to sand it at some point. But with interrupted cuts, or any sort of like multi-axis turning, typically you end up with a little bit more sanding, and if you're doing something that's a little bit less offsetting like this, you can sand on a lathe pretty nicely. But this, there's no choice but to hand sand afterward. So by taking a little bit more time to do these nice refining cuts, this is where that cost benefit is really in your favor, because you cut out on the amount of sanding and blending that you need to do. So what we've done is created this nice symmetrical look to our heart. This is part where if we take the time to turn the sides and advance all the sides, you get this cool variation in one, the curved profile you can kind of see here, but also how the faces meet. And this is a little check too. If I'm at my shop making one of these, that's got to be this nice finished product using this really, really nice piece of wood. I'll flip back and forth until I see that everything is perfect. And you can kind of see right here, there's a little bit of a bump that you can flip back and forth and clean up, or you can just spend a little bit of time with your sandpaper and working on both surfaces to keep this crisp edge. That's one of the things to consider if you're making this and you're sanding at the very end. You want to try to keep this crisp edge between the faces and the sides. So it's a little bit of a nice contrast going to this nice curve, and you have this pointed, crisp transition in between. I think it makes for a pretty nice appearance. So right here, if you switch to the tailstock view, you can see that we went from our hot air balloon shape to a nice heart shape just by opening up the sides into that bowl, right? So you can imagine just like turning a natural edge bowl on a curved, log surface. Part of the, two sides are a little bit higher than the other two sides. That's where we're going. This would be like if this was the log surface like this. These two edges of the bowl are a little bit lower than these two edges, and you end up with this nice lobe sort of shape, right? So it looks pretty good. I'm pretty pleased with this heart. Let's turn away this tenon, flip it around, and jam it into a little wooden jam check, and then we'll friction check, and then we'll turn away the other tenon, and I'll talk about how to mount these, and then you guys can go home and eat some chili. Right? I know that's not today, but chili's on my mind. That's all it is. I love chili. I have to usually make it a lot, but it's been quite a while now. Let's see. Right in front of me. There we go. So we're going to take the time to turn off this tenon, really focus on making this smooth cut, and continue this curved surface so that ideally we don't have a flat spot. We just continue this until the inside or outside of the bowl, this round bottom bowl, is pretty nice. So I will start by just doing some pull cuts. Putting pressure toward the chuck, right? And what I'm doing is I'm just kind of evaluating the depth of that center pin hole. I didn't talk about this, but what I'll do when I put this between centers is sometimes I'll use a mirror. And it could be something as simple as using a tiny little washer, right, over the edge of your life center, right, to limit how far that center point is going to go in. Right? And you can use two. Right? And the reason I'm doing that is I don't want to spend so much time making this really nice curve, and then I have this really deep hole where I have to reevaluate that curve and make it again. And it's not that big of a deal. We'll talk about why that is in just a second. But all I'm doing is I'm trying to minimize the marked surface. Right? So here, we're just doing these little shaping cuts, and now I got rid of that hole, and now I can transition this. And so I'm going to get flat, so all I'm doing, this is one of my favorite things to do, just back and forth, shaving the wood away, and blend your curves in. And this is like anything else. If you find that you have a little bit of a flat spot and it's just eating at you like it does with me, just spend an extra few minutes with your sandpaper, just going back and forth, maybe a sanding sponge or something like that, and you can get rid of that flat spot, right? But here, we have this pretty nice surfaces, a tiny little nub, right, that you can just take away in 20 seconds with some sandpaper, 5 seconds with some sandpaper, but that's good enough. Good surface here. This is ready to be sanded. We're going to flip it around and turn off the tenon on the other side. Now, this is one of the other changes that I have from the article. Is I used to use these. I went to this antique store. It's called the Green Gardenia in Chattanooga. And why am I talking about an antique store? Well, there's a sawyer there that he puts all of his wood in the back of the antique store, and it's awesome. If you're ever in Chattanooga, it's terrible. Don't go there. You don't want to buy that wood. Save it for me. No, it's a really great resource for like good quality, locally sawed wood. But also, when I was there looking for wood one day, I found this set of old turned bowls, like 8 Japanese turned bowls that were made of beech, for I paid like $5 for these hand turned wood bowls. It was insane. They weren't the best quality, but it was nice. It was like, well, I'll just buy a little bowl and I'll have the opportunity to practice embellishing, painting, or carving, or whatever. But it ended up being a pretty nice shape for jamming something into. The problem is that I found out after making quite a few of these is there's a lot of opportunity when you have this bowl and you're only touching the edges of the heart. There's a lot of opportunity to shift, right? So when I'm turning away the tenon on this heart, if I'm shifting, that's going to cause me to lose that symmetry that I've tried so hard to keep. And I'll end up, maybe this is kind of extreme, turning it away so that way my high point is right here and it just ends up looking funky. So instead I just went with this traditional, this is a big piece of cedar. I had it because because I had it, and just use whatever wood is available to you. I made a little shallow dish that that I was hoping would fit the profile of the heart. I think it's going to be pretty nice, and I'll use a piece of drawer liner. Fortunate enough, before I started turning, we bought our house that we currently live in, and the previous owners left like 40 feet of this drawer liner, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but don't throw anything away, right? And when I started turning, it ended up being just the really perfect material for jamming into this. It doesn't have oil in it like some that you find, but it gives you a lot of friction. Okay, so now I have this heart jammed into this jam chuck, and I have my friction liner for friction, and I can just focus on turning away this tenon, and I'll get to the point of getting pretty close to where my center point is, and then you just spend a little bit of time with sandpaper, or you leave the hole, and that's what you can use to mount the heart with, and I'll just talk about that for a few minutes after I'm done. Any questions or anything? I always find that toward the end of the demo, I start speaking really quickly. So if I sound like watching a YouTube video at 1.5 speed, tell me to slow down. Again, right here. All right, so let's turn this on and turn away my tenon. You can see there's a little bit of wobble right here, and that is okay. That's not that much. Trying to speed down when you're doing this, again, just kind of stay out of the line of fire, and it should be fine. All right, turn it up. I'll keep it a little bit slower than normal, maybe down to about 800 or so. And then just make some pull sets. So keep a little bit more pressure toward the jam chuck this time than I was before, even though I was before. And you can see I'm doing a lot of chatter right there. So I'll just be conscious of that. I'm doing this. And this is something where, just like if you're second turning the bowl, or you're turning around to finish the bottom, usually there's going to be a little bit of movement. And you can always blend that with your sandpaper. And pretty close here. And then we'll make a few kind of push cuts, really lightly though. So a little bit of excitement in the demonstration. Then we'll just go back and forth. And we'll get to the point where you can keep refining this. But I'll kind of stop there because all I would do afterward is just take a little chisel, knock off that nub, and then sand off the surface. And so it's a little bit flat. I don't like that. I should have taken the time to adjust that a bit, but that's fine. I'll just think about it the entire drive home. No big deal. No big deal. I'm just kidding. So then I would just take this, knock this off, carve it off, or whatever. And here I can see it's a little bit deep, so I'm ending up with a tiny little hole on the surface. And that's okay because we're going to use that hole for our mounting strategy. So I'm going to talk about that for just a few minutes. And then I'll open the floor up to any questions that you might have. So how do you mount this heart? We've spent so much time focusing on getting a sharp point that you can't just stick this on a surface and expect it to stay up. Well, I went through quite a process to get to where I wanted to get and what I use now. This is the first heart. So for that forum challenge I was talking about, this is the first one that I'll pass this one around so you guys can see. Go on. Just don't turn it around and feel that surface that we just finished. Just kidding. That forum challenge, I made this heart out of white oak and I finished it. I was like, how am I going to stand this up? So I thought it would be pretty cool to make this metal stand. And it was cool at the time, but now I look back at it, it's kind of sloppy. And if you can't really see this pretty well, maybe in the reflection, not so well. Yeah, there we go. So you can kind of see there's some little burnish marks where this copper wire digs into the surface. As it moves around, it's ruining the surface that you spent so much time to do. But I do like the fact that you can remove your heart. So I wanted to think about how you could do this even better. And so I started out with something like this, where I had this little pedestal and had just a little piece of wire. This was just prototype, piece of wire where the heart would lean back on. And it was pretty nice, if the heart was still, but you can see it's not that secure. If somebody walked by, the heart would fall over. So what do you do there? Well, I'll pass this around too. It's not that interesting, but it was kind of nice to touch wood. So what do you do with that? Well, I thought about this strategy where, what if I use that one of the holes that's on the back side of the surface, like that heart that's being passed around, and I attach a magnet to that and use rare earth magnets. I use magnets for a lot of different things. So I came up with this idea of using a spoon for this mounting point. And this was a spoon that was in our kitchen cabinet, and my wife came out one, love her, right? She came out one day, saw me cutting apart one of our spoons. She's like, what are you doing? And I told her this would be this great idea. It'll be worth it when I'm done. And she did not believe that, but it was just a spoon, right? So I used the spoon. The reason why I chose it was spoons have this, it always sounds a little bit weird talking about how cool spoons are, spoon handles are, but they have this really nice curve. You know, things are designed ergonomically, and you know that curve of a spoon is intentionally made at such an angle to where it fits in your hand. It feels good. Well, it just so happens that that curve is also really nicely in the context of being able to fit a heart to it and have that heart mounted a little bit like this. This is kind of a weird angle for the camera, so I'll just hold it up like this. This curved portion of the spoon gets out of the way when your heart is standing upright like this. So you have a way to display your heart upright with a pretty delicate backer to it, and it's not interfering with that clean look that you wanted. The problem with that is magnets are really strong, and I got to the point of, you know, I had this heart, I spent a whole lot of time, I epoxied this magnet to my base, and one day the magnet just ripped off from the epoxy, and you know, I've since done some different things, but it wasn't an ideal solution. And I'll wrap this up quickly. I know it's not the most interesting part of the talk, but I like hearing about processes. So I'm like, what if I do just keep the hole, and I made this heart to look like kind of a balloon sitting right here. But at the end of the day, I still wanted to keep this point on the heart, and I also wanted you to be able to remove the heart so you could, it's kind of fun to handhold an object. So how do I do that, keeping this idea, but making it more secure that the magnet's not going to rip off? Well, I have a friend in California that's, don't judge me by saying I have a friend in California, all right? Just kidding, and if you're from California, I apologize for that joke. Actually, if I could live anywhere in the country for the landscape and the geography, California would probably be it, but I can't ever afford to live there. So I have this friend that lives in California. He does a lot of folk art out there, and he works with a lot of tools and old tree knurled spoons and forks. And he saw a picture of something that I sent him, and he said, "Hey, I have a bunch of these spoons. Do you want them?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And he sent me like 100 or 50 or 100 antique spoons of all these different shapes that were even more elegant than the one that I just showed that's up here. So I took that same approach. I drilled a hole in it, and now I have this removable hardware, just a knurled brass nut and a threaded insert in the heart, and you have a much more secure way to hold the heart, and it's removable, and it kind of looks cool with a little bit of brass hardware. But that's what I've settled on, and I think it's, in terms of how do you display a heart, make it removable, and keep that fine bottom point, this is the best solution that I've found so far. I'll pass this around as well. It's kind of cool. It's a piece of Bradford pear. Terrible tree while it's alive. It's invasive, it's aggressive, it displaces a lot of native plants. When it's dead, it's awesome because it carves, it turns, it sands really well. And I got most of my Bradford pear blanks from my neighbor's big tree that keeps falling apart every time we have a storm. So free wood also, which is great. But anyway, I think that's about all I have to say. You know, the cool thing about these, one more thing, aside from all, I'll talk about one real quick thing is, the nice thing about making these, like anything else turning wise, is you can make something that displays the wood really beautifully, and you just make the grain and the wood color the showcase. Or you can do something like this heart that's being passed around and take this wood that's relatively bland, carve it, and do something, you know, a little bit more to it than just on the lathe. Yes, sir.
How do you like to finish your pieces?
So it just depends. With this heart that's being passed around, I use India ink to ebonize it. But if you've ever used India ink, it has a shellac component to it, and sometimes it looks really plasticky, which shellac tends to do if you don't do a nice polish to it. So I'll put some lacquer on it. I put some oil on it. I think I used hemp oil as well. It's like tung oil, polymerizing oil. And I let it cure, and then I put a satin lacquer coat over it. For these hearts, I typically go I just use rattle lacquer for the most part, satin lacquer. But for other ones, like I think this white oak heart, I just use a shellac finish and then just buffed it so it had like a satin shine to it. The reason I did that is I have some liming wax that I put in the grain, and shellac was a good way to keep that liming wax in the grain instead of rubbing off on something. But most of the time, lacquer or oil finish.
Also, this kind of off the cheap, but you use any of your turnings as teaching aids in your classes.
Not yet. No, I haven't. I'm trying to think. No, I haven't. But that would be a good idea too. It's kind of fun. I'm glad you said that. Let's think about our turning history and how we got involved. And the first person that inspired me to want to start turning was my dean at the time. This guy Roy Sofield. If any of you know, that'd be a small world thing. But he, at our department and division meetings, he would turn pens. He was mostly a pen turner, but he would bring pens in the occasional bowl and then raffle them off. Just like whose birthday it is this month, and they'll have a raffle, and he'd give them a pen. So I ended up getting a couple of pens from him over the years. And then one day I talked to him about it. I'm like, oh, you got to tell me how you make these. They're really beautiful. And he started talking about turning, and then he talked about how he got into it, and it got to the point where, among other things, I need to try this because I really appreciated his pieces, but I also even more so appreciated that he was willing to spend his time to make something really beautiful and then just give it away. And in some degrees, it's like, why would you just give something like that away? And I didn't get it until I started turning. And when I was just doing flat work, I would never think about giving away a piece of furniture that I've spent too long on. But when you're turning something, it's a different thing. And I think the best thing that you can do is make something and give it to someone. They'll appreciate it as a gift, but then it makes you feel good to give something away. So I took that to heart, and Roy was also just a really, really nice guy anyway. He retired, so I feel like I'm talking about him like he passed away, but he retired and he's living his best life right now, turning all the time and not having to deal with students. But it was him that inspired me. But no, I have not taken any of my turnings as classroom aids, but I'll see if I can work that into the curriculum now.
Coronary arteries in your blood.
Yeah. Oh, you guys are giving me ideas.
Vacuum chuck for the last part.
I don't have a vacuum checking system. I've never used it, and I have been telling myself for about a year that I need to. And that would be the ideal way to go for sure. It's one of those things that I'll put out next week. Next week I'll get into it.
Well, especially since you can use the nib to center it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, vacuum checking is the way to go. It's kind of like cleaning my shop. I'll think about, all right, I'll set this system up, or I could just go and turn something, and so I'll do it next week. But yeah, that would be the best way to go for sure, like hands down. Yes, sir.
What's the largest art you've turned?
The largest heart, nothing mega big, but I started with a 10 by 10 block. So the finished heart is maybe about this big, black locust, and it's really nice. I never finished it, so it's kind of sitting waiting to be sanded. That was kind of exciting doing the last little bits. Black locust, if you've never turned it, it was a piece of hard, dry black locust. And pecan has that joke when it's dry, it's pecan-crete. Black locust is like the stringiest, hardest wood I've ever turned, and I love it. But yeah, that's waiting for me to finish. And yeah, it's like 10 by, I think it ended up being about 10 inches high by 9 inches wide or so. I don't know if I'd like to go bigger than that. I think this 6 by 6 size is the sweet spot for being able to hold it. And honestly, I think some things look a little bit better smaller than they do bigger. And I'd rather have this than the bigger one. But it would be cool to turn a mega heart though. I've got a Vic Mark 300, and man, I should turn something big on that. But maybe one day, next week, right?
So you're saying the Bradford was wet
Yes.
when you did that. Did you do many of them wet?
I do most of them dry. Yeah, I use the wet wood for just practicing the different shapes, but if I do, that's a good question. this is something where the finished product is still really thick, and you end up with uneven thickness for the wall. So when you think about drying and cracking, you give it every opportunity to crack. But I have turned some green wood where I'll turn the hearts, or I'll boil the blank first, or turn the heart and then boil the blank. And if you've never boiled wood before, it's a great way to mitigate cracking that might be a problem otherwise. And so I've done that for a few times. You have to sand away that oxidized layer that you get on the outside. But most of the time, I'll start with a dry blank, and that way I don't have to sit around and wait for it to dry, and don't have to worry about cracking as much. It's not as fun to turn dry.
Well, but you decorated that one
Mhm.
because of that crack.
Yeah, absolutely, I did. Yeah. And that's part of the thing too, when you're starting out with your design, where are you going to go with it? And if you know you're going to carve a lot of the surface and paint it, embellish it, or whatever, yeah, start with something green. That's going to be a more pleasant experience. And then let those cracks dictate the specific pattern you're carving, or not. Yes, sir.
Do you ever put a glass tube or a plastic tube in them where they put flowers?
I haven't. I've never used them as wet bases, but that'd be smart. That'd be a good way to go as well. I think for that larger heart, whenever I finish it, I'll do that so I can actually hold some live flowers. But it'd be easy enough to do that. I'd probably try to get a shorter one where you couldn't see the glass, and but I haven't done that before. That would also be pretty cool if you wanted to do something where you had like an open center and have the glass tube coming down and get this. I think that would be. Spend a little bit more time turning a hole in the middle of it. It would be pretty fun.
What kind of material was on the black stand?
That's India ink. Yeah, India ink, which is the stand. I'm sorry, I thought you said the black stain. So funny, that was a piece of holly that I cut and I bleached. I wanted it to look like marble, almost like a stone, a weathered stone. And so I have a lot of holly, and I cut it, turned it. And that was actually the first time I tried bleaching wood, was that. And I just didn't really know what I was doing. I tried to over bleach and it started to turn yellow. I didn't neutralize the bleach afterwards. So it had this nice, pristine white appearance, and then a week later, it looked like pee. Yeah, maybe you like that, it's fine. But it just wasn't attractive, so I put an acrylic wash over the top of it, and then just patted my paintbrush to give it like a stone sort of texture. Ideally, it would have just been the bleached wood, but I screwed that up, and I didn't want to make a base for it.
It turned out nice.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Well, hey, this has been fun. I really like this. I do think of it a little bit like a job, but man, as far as a job, it's the most enjoyable thing I can imagine. I love turning. I love talking to you guys, and it's just. I'm really fortunate that you had me here and gave me this opportunity. It's fun. It's just so much fun, and thank you all for being here and staying awake. Good too, and laughing at my jokes like that. That's the best part. Thank you. But yeah, I appreciate it. And if you have any questions, like I said, get in touch with me. I think maybe my contact information is on the newsletter. If it's not, then Rick or Dr. Annette, a lot of people know it, but if you have any questions or you make a heart, send me pictures, questions about the process, let me know, or anything else, just holler at me. Yes, sir.
So October 26th, join us for our Oktoberfest.
I might have to.
Have
Yeah.
some chili.
Yeah, I'll send my wife to her family. I'll come and hang out with you guys. No, thank you. I might have to come back for that. That sounds like a good time. Yeah,
You might
might
have
as
to
well.
make pizza, you might have to make some chili.
Good excuse to make chili. That's fair enough. I'll try to make it really bad so you guys' chili looks really good. Yeah, thanks. I'll try to make it out. That'd be a good time for sure. But, yeah, thank you all again. Oh, sure. Here, I've got, let's see, let me do this. Try this method. This is my copy, so. Let's see. Hold your clipboard.